We'll get into that on a future episode, I'm sure. But the point we're trying to make is long before there was a Monday Night War, there was indeed a pay-per-view war, and we're going to talk about it today. The Clash of the Champions that we're discussing today is essentially round 3 in that war. Vince McMahon made the first strike in November of 87. Of course, the NWA had presented their biggest annual event, Starrcade, on pay-per-view, and that was the very first time that Vince presented Survivor Series. So to kind of set the backstage here, the backstory is big wrestling shows on Thanksgiving Day had been a tradition for Jim Crockett for years and years. And in the years prior, it had been presented only as closed circuit. Starrcade 87 was the first actual Crockett pay-per-view, and we'll cover that show sometime in the future, I'm sure. But on that night in November of 87, not only did the fans have to choose Starrcade or Survivor Series, but the cable systems did too. Of course, Vince wanted to counter-program that and make the fans choose, and Jim Crockett tried to be accommodating to the fans and the cable systems, and they actually moved their show from an evening start to an afternoon start. But when they do this, Jim Crockett winds up on the losing end of the stick still, because Vince goes out and cuts deals with the cable systems that says, if you choose to air Starrcade over Survivor Series, we will not let you run WrestleMania. And most all of those cable systems gave in to Vince's demands, and that's a big deal at the time. So the WWF's counter-strike was hugely successful, and the Survivor Series outsells Starrcade at a rate of more than 2-1. And let's remember, this is the very first Survivor Series. People don't even really know what they're getting. Starrcade is now the top show for Jim Crockett for years and years. But with the exception of a few strongholds they had markets for Jim Crockett, everybody else just elects to cover the Survivor Series because they don't want to lose the potential WrestleMania revenue. Let's get in our Wayback Machine here, Tony. What was the reaction to learning that Vince was going to present Survivor Series head-to-head with Starrcade? And then when did you guys know that that was going down?
I knew it was going down almost when everybody did. It's something that we discussed in the office. I think everybody was really pissed because I think this is known as the Sabotage of Starrcade. And it was, in many ways, I guess, a good business move, but in many ways it was a move that Vince was showing that, he thought this was a fight and he had the tools to win the fight. That was a big turning point in Jim Crockett Promotions. That combined with the sale of or the purchase of the UWF, to me, were two of the things that really helped hurt Jim Crockett Promotions and had it go downhill. So
you consider it to be smart, but a dirty tactic.
Dirty tactic, but a smart business tactic. He wanted to run his opposition out of business, and that helped do it.
What was the common thinking regarding Crockett getting into pay-per-view at this time? Is this, at the time, considered, the next level, so to speak, or is it just something they're going to try since Vince had been successful with it?
No, it's considered the next level. They had a plan to move ahead and forge ahead, not to try it. The Starrcade had not really been a pay-per-view, Conrad, but Starrcade before that had been a closed-circuit event.
Right.
And that closed-circuit event was very successful, showing a Starrcade in Greensboro and having a closed circuit and all the other outlets in the Crockett territory had been successful. So this was just the next step moving forward. I don't think this was we'll stick our foot in the water, see what it is. I think they were full bore going ahead with this, and this was part of the business plan.
Dusty Rhodes has told stories about going with Jim Crockett to meet with cable systems in New York and knowing right then that they weren't going to carry him. Obviously, Vince already had a foothold in pay-per-view, so he has the power position here. And back then, as we said, you negotiated a lot of those deals with the individual cable system providers. It's a lot different than what many of us remember from the mid-'90s with like Viewer's Choice and In Demand and stuff like that. Do you remember hearing about any of those specific meetings with cable systems?
I remember and I was involved in this one. The cable system wanted one of our wrestlers to make an appearance, and I'm not so sure where that was right now. I'm thinking it was out west somewhere. And we had scheduled Barry Windham to make that appearance, and Barry did a no-show. And it goes back to, again, I talked about this on an earlier episode, how much no-shows hurt the business. And I remember I was to call Barry at his home, and I talked to his wife or his girlfriend at that time, I can't remember, and they said that Barry did not know about this appearance. And I said, well, we need to get him there. And, of course, we were not a very organized business. We didn't have a big staff like Vince had up in Connecticut. So here I am working kind of in the back scenes, working in the office with Sandy Scott and Gene Anderson, and they had me call Barry, and I told him Barry's not going to show. And I think that really hurt Jimmy's standing with some of the cable companies. That's one of the things that I remember about meetings with cable systems. And it just a feeling about that. Dusty had some star power, and I can understand Dusty going to cable system meetings, but I have a feeling that when Vince met with cable systems,
Hulk Hogan wasn't there.
Well, yeah, exactly. And Vince had all these people, had this whole staff of people probably going to meet with cable systems, where Jimmy just had like a couple. So you could see as a cable system, I'm thinking, I may be wrong, here we got this guy who has this whole marketing and a team versus two people.
Yeah.
So I think the presentation there to the cable systems was, well, we're dealing with a much bigger company as opposed to a smaller company.
After pulling this stunt, a lot of the cable systems jump in and warn Vince not to put them in this position again and don't intentionally schedule pay-per-views head-to-head with the NWA. So 2 months later, Crockett presents Bunkhouse Stampede in January of '88. There had been many Bunkhouse Stampedes prior to this, but this is the first time it was on pay-per-view. And since Vince had just gotten his hand slapped for doing a head-to-head pay-per-view, he instead opts to do a free show on the USA Network head-to-head, and he called it the Royal Rumble. So for you longtime WWF fans, Survivor Series and Royal Rumble were actually created in response to Crockett shows. So stick that in your pipe and smoke it.
How about that, damn it?
Yeah, there you go. So, Tony, when Vince did the Royal Rumble for free as an answer to Bunkhouse Stampede, how was that perceived by the office at JCP? Were folks spinning this like Vince is scared, he's nervous, or was it more the bastard's trying to put us out of business?
It's more the bastard trying to put us out of business. I don't think anyone thought Vince was scared or nervous. Everyone kind of thought that the more you would push Vince, the more he would push back. And I think we had to show as Crockett Promotions kind of a united front, and you had to deal from strength. So I don't think anyone thought Vince was scared at all, but I think everyone thought that he was trying to put us out of business, which eventually he did, right?
Absolutely. I'm curious, though, when you're saying, that we think he's trying to put us out of business, is the common feeling, I mean, is no one delusional enough to think that they're competing or they're just as good? Or does Dusty and the Crockett's and everybody know, hey, we're playing second fiddle right now?
That was never discussed. Dusty had a big influence on the company. And going to a cable system meeting shows you how much of an influence he had on the company. I don't think Dusty ever thought he was second fiddle. I think he thought he could compete with Vince McMahon, and I think Jimmy Crockett and everybody bought into it. Dusty had, again, just a tremendous influence. Dusty had a massive ego. And he also had a great business sense about him, and whatever Dusty wanted back then, Dusty could get. I think everybody knew that. I think some of the shows saw that. And I'm not saying it was bad. I love Dusty. I really did. But his influence was profound, and whatever he felt about Vince McMahon, whatever he felt about our company, the entire company felt about it in the front office. Well, I'm not speaking for the boys.
He wasn't without flaw, though. The Bunkhouse Stampede was a Dusty Rhodes creation, and I'm sure we'll cover it in more detail one day. But as we mentioned, the 88 version is the first time it's presented on pay-per-view. And for the exact reason you just laid out, that Dusty had an ego and he thought he could compete and he never considered himself second fiddle. He wants to run this show in Vince's backyard. So the show happens at the Nassau Coliseum in New York. It only draws 6,000 or 7,000 people, which is less than half of capacity. Meanwhile, the Royal Rumble that same night drew more than 18,000. Neither show was well received, and specifically, there is a ton of backlash against the Bunkhouse match itself. A lot of fans didn't like that Dusty won it again, or that the show ran short. Apparently, they even printed the wrong time to start the show on the tickets. Tony, if this were a boxing match, wouldn't this be 2 rounds in a row here for the WWF with Starrcade and now the Bunkhouse Stampede?
Yeah, it may have been 2 rounds for the WWF, with the second round being a knockout. Again, you talk about all this and you talk about the wars here, and I understand about all the fucking wars. I really do, and I understand about trying to be the better of two. But to me, what smacks of Crockett not making it is wrong time on the ticket, show running short.
Yeah.
Those are just things that you should not do, and those things hurt your business in the long run and make you seem second fiddle, right?
Sure.
You wanted to seem like you were on par with Vince, but if you can't even have the right times printed on the tickets, or you cannot even have you have a show that runs short, you're looked upon as, well, they have good wrestling, but those guys are fucked. They're fucked up. And again, I'm thinking this is part of it was a very mom and pop's business back then, a very small business, understaffed greatly. Vince, when I went to work for Vince in 1989, I remember thinking, holy shit, this is a big time operation.
Right.
They have people everywhere, and they are organized. They had 2 offices. They had a production studio. I mean, Crockett's had nothing like that. So in their effort to compete with the WWE, I think going back and looking at it, and not a criticism of the Crockett's, who I owe certainly almost everything to, but I think we can say that a lot of times they put their money in the wrong place.